Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Power Up Your Databases. This is part of the Nutanix Power Up Your Database webinar series, and this is the third event in the multi-part series. We have 4 more events still to come in this series, so look out in your email inbox for invitations to those upcoming events. Thank you so much for joining us on this special event. As you can see there on video, we've got our expert presenters. I'll introduce you to them in just a moment. But before we do, I want to remind everyone out there that this event is brought to you by Nutanix. And as such, we have a number of resources available on today's topic there in the Handouts tab on the left-hand side of your audience console. You'll see there the Nutanix Database Solutions landing page, Nutanix for Microsoft SQL Server, Nutanix for Oracle databases, and the test drive era link that we'll talk about later in the event. Also, a couple of special resources there on how to turn your databases into a service, and 5 reasons to run your database on Nutanix. So make sure you check out those resources. Also, we encourage you to use the questions box there on the left-hand side of your audience console. We'll be doing a dedicated Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, so get your questions in early. And then finally, we'll be announcing the winner of our Visa $300 gift card at the end of today's live event. If you're watching this on demand, I'm sorry, the drawing has already occurred. The prize terms are also available there in the Handouts tab. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as your moderator. I should have mentioned that a little bit earlier. And it's now my esteemed duty here to introduce today's 2 expert presenters. They are Mr. Chris Papp, Solutions Marketing Manager at Nutanix, and Mr. Tony Baer, Principal at DB Insight LLC. Tony, Chris, great to have you.
Okay. Thanks, David. Thanks for having me this afternoon. Chris, looking forward to our discussion over the next hour. It's a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff we're going to be going through here, and basically, I love this slide. But anyway, talking about a lot. I've been talking to a lot of my clients, and basically, cloud is obviously you can't have a conversation on technology in the year 2020 without talking about cloud. And cloud, is in many ways, and we'll get into this, in the next few slides. It's basically seen as very much of a way to deal with, to essentially clear through existing, technology bottlenecks that have basically that just steadily persisted over the years. But in so doing, there's some new bottlenecks that have cropped up, and what we're going to be talking about today is the data bottleneck that I presume that if you're on this call, you're probably perceiving. It's not theoretical. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, initially, we're going to kind of look at the trajectory here, like why are we having this conversation? What's the evolution of cloud adoption in the enterprise? And then we'll cut to the chase, which is this is all about we're getting overloaded. We're getting snowed by data, too much information. And then we'll go into looking at, what's this whole idea about database as a service, and then we'll look at basically the role of hyper-converged infrastructure and how it can basically help you deal with some of these. And then Chris will take us home and we'll talk about Nutanix's solutions. So just moving ahead here. So why are we having this conversation? And cloud, there are a number of tactical reasons and a number of strategic reasons. And tactical, as we'll show in the next slide, a lot of the early adoption of cloud was tactical, which makes sense. Things very often start in the back door like PCs did. Basically it was a tactical response by departments that basically could not wait for IS, or at that time they called it MIS, this is back in the 1980s, to give them, compute support, and they had they wanted to take charge of their own, desktop productivity. Well, cloud, a lot of the early justification for cloud was very similar. There are some budgeting drivers there, which is that try and propose, let's say, new acquisitions in your CapEx budget. There are a lot of hurdles. There's a lot of red tape. And typically these are multi-year plans. So there's a lot of lead time on all that. Whereas with cloud, you can now basically pay as you go. It becomes an operating expense. And with that comes a new type of agility, because you don't have to hold your projects hostage to the vagaries and to the bottlenecks and red tape of capital budgeting. And out of that, when you initially run compute in the cloud, there's a certain degree of operational simplification. There are many different degrees of it, but at the lowest level, let's say you're running dev test in the cloud. That means that you didn't have to procure those clusters. You don't have to run and manage them. You just use them when you need them, and you stop it when you don't. And so that basically moves a lot of operational overhead. So it's kind of it's sort of a glimpse of the type of simplification that cloud can provide. And that's where we start looking on the more strategic side, which is that by using the cloud, how can this change the business? Well, part of this, there are just some ongoing secular trends of what we call digital transformation. I hate that term, but the thing is, there's a reality to it, because that more and more business, over the years, and this has been going on for the last few decades, ever since the .com years, has been going digital. And that's even accelerating even further in the current day. I don't think we have to talk to any of you out there in terms of, how much of your operation, especially you're dealing with your partners, your customers, is now going digital and now going virtual. It also can provide the opportunity to consolidate data silos, and that can give you new visibility over your data. As we're going to talk to you about, that's great, but yet we're getting more data all the time. We'll talk more about this. This problem is not getting any simpler; it's getting more complex. So it makes this consolidation, even more vital. It also basically, with the cloud, it gives you the opportunity to apply new approaches to cybersecurity and to deal with streaming in real time. Chris, do you have anything to add to all this?
I think one of the key things that you hit on that has, funny enough, kind of created some additional problems is one of the triggers for moving to the cloud was that simplification, like that, having that service up there and removing that operational overhead. And I think the reason I say that it's caused some problems is when, if you're in IT, the expectations on IT or the DBA has changed dramatically from like what the business expects of them, from what their customer. They no longer have the capacity or the appetite to wait days or weeks for things to get done. They want it instantaneously, right? Just like how you can spin an instance up in the cloud and get it going, or whatever you're running from a business perspective. We're seeing that, and that IT departments and data professionals are having problems trying to keep up with that. So,
yeah, no question about that.
Point,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, there's sometimes we can get into good trouble, and this sort of is how we got here. I was sort of hinting at this before, that basically that there were tactical and strategic reasons, and it started tactically. And I hope that the slide is legible. We have, in some cases, white on white there, so I have to apologize. But started when Amazon basically started AWS in 2006. It was based out of a realization that Amazon had that to conduct our core business, we need to become masters of in IT, and they realized that they had a core competence in setting up these internet data centers. They thought, hey, why don't we just build more of this and sell capacity? I think at the time they thought, oh, here's an idea. Let's sling some mud up the wall and see if it sticks. To the present day, where basically AWS is now contributing the lion's share of profit, in Amazon. A huge part of their growth story. But anyway, back in 2006, even though there were some, we could say that in a way that Salesforce invented the modern cloud back in 1999 with software as a service. I think cloud, beyond this isolated occurrence of this application, really started to really take hold when we started seeing some cloud services, and app dev teams could realize that, something. Why do we need to buy why do we need to buy a set of machines to test our apps? Why don't we just essentially rent some capacity in the cloud and run that stuff. There's nothing really strategic here. And so there was very much of a petty cash purchase. That evolved over the next 5 years or so. And I think the single, basically, I guess, kind of watershed event was the emergence of the iPhone, the smartphone, and more importantly, the opening of the App Store, when all of a sudden Apple opened this up to developers. And it meant that basically not just developers, it meant that enterprises could now start to develop mobile apps to reach, whether it be their customers or their business partners, with mobile apps. And where was the logical place to develop this? Well, you didn't want to wait for the backlogs in IT so you can maybe buy the capacity. But the other thing is also is that when you're dealing with mobile, it's kind of like the same thing with the internet. It's like you're dealing with very, with traffic volumes that are not easy to predict. And so it's not the type of thing which lends itself well to capital budgeting, to long-term planning. So basically in the 2010s is, where we really saw the explosion there, kind of a Cambrian explosion of new mobile apps. And that really fueled basically use of the cloud, beyond basically, just tactical dev test. We then started to pick up further steam with basically, emergence of more SaaS, application services, but also a lot of new cloud-only services, such as like with AutoML, with machine learning, AI, basically cloud translation services, cloud, basically services for recognizing text. What I'm saying now is I made up this slide actually before, basically the start of the pandemic. I made up this slide actually in late last year, is that I really saw the 2020s as becoming the year, becoming the decade really of transformation, that now enterprises have really gotten it's not just their feet wet. They're now basically hip deep, and they're looking at, and especially with a lot of their on-premise applications are starting to get old. Some are looking to retire. And they're seeing all this operational complexity that, as they basically have to start dealing with new challenges, is really starting to get the better of them. And that's where I'm calling something called the hybrid default. It's not to say that every cloud migration is going to be to hybrid, but it's that what enterprises are realizing is that we need to get these opportunities, these advantages of the cloud, the advantages of basically operational simplicity, of agility. But we need to get that regardless of whether we go in the public cloud or not. And that's why I kind of called this the hybrid default. Chris, would you like to jump in here?
I think you hit all the points, but like leading into that hybrid default is, one of the big questions that I have, and I think a lot of customers have when they come in, is I think they don't plan on ending up in that hybrid kind of situation. I think they're like, okay, let's see what fits in the cloud. And then when they get up there, they're like, how long do we stay here, right? Like, is this the new normal, right? And we see that a lot. And that's where, obviously, coming from Nutanix, most customers that we're working with are in that hybrid. Like, that is their new normal. They're always going to be hybrid. But there's a lot of conversation. You and I offline have talked, like, okay, like
right,
moving this out a couple of years, is that hybrid default going to be going away, and it's going to be public cloud, right? Those hyperscalers, will that be the default?
Yeah. And the other part that I should also give the emphasis to is also default. And that up until now, the recent era, default choice for most existing, I'm not talking about new greenfield born in the cloud applications, but most existing applications, the base assumption was deploy on premises and justify whether you go to the cloud. What I'm basically forecasting that in this decade, it's not the coming decade anymore. It was the coming decade when I first wrote this last fall. Is that now basically the default will essentially assume some sort of form of cloud native deployment, where you would have to justify as to whether you go back to to kind of sort of a more conventional on-premise type architecture. Does that kind of jive with what you've been hearing, Chris?
Yeah, it does. I think the one thing that I'd be curious, and I think the audience would be curious to hear more, that lines right up, is the kind of that multi-cloud kind of setup too that customers are finding themselves in.
Oh, wait for my ZDNet post tomorrow. Oh boy, have I got news for you guys. Little plug here, cheap plug here. But anyway, we're talking about the cloud as being, this whole promise for strategic transformation. when it's really rooted from it's not that we're trying to strategically transform for the heck of it, is that there's a need, a bottled up need for innovation. Hasn't started overnight. This has been building for years, building ever since the .com. I think it's basically even picked up even further in the current scenario, where essentially the core assumptions of how you do business, of the products and services mix that you deliver, are changing just because of very practical needs that are coming out of what's basically in the new, in at least what's now the new norm. And do we know what the new norm is going to be next year? No, we don't. What we do know is that we need to basically offload as much operational complexity as possible so we can focus on innovation. What's compounding this, and this is really what we're going to be taught. We're going to be turning on the rest of this this discussion. Is really the growth of data estate, and the fact is that as we are transforming, we're no longer dealing with these traditional enterprise walled garden databases of transaction data, which we then then organized into data warehouses for analytics. This data is coming at us from all directions, and in many cases, this is data that also, you're just looking at data gravity, lives in the cloud. And so we need to have some sort of consistent way of dealing with it, regardless of where that data is. Chris, what are you basically hearing from your customers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost going to, I don't want to jump the gun on what you have coming up next in terms of what you're talking about. But it segues right into what we're hearing from customers is just, the different areas that they're keeping their data and how their data state's spread out is causing exactly that, too much information for them. It's too much. They need it, but like, how do they manage it? And what's the effects on their databases, right?
It's like a huge OMG moment. And the fact is, it's no secret to any of you on this call, data volumes are growing. There have been any number of forecasts that basically show that data volumes are typically increasing geometrically each year. It just gets crazy. But along with that, it's not like all of a sudden we have this great, top-down approach for dealing with all this. We've been trying to tame data across the enterprise, it seems for eons. I mean, ever since the first applications started to emerge on PCs and mid-range machines. And so I remember back, in the 1980s where, we talk about the enterprise data model. We saw how far that went. The thing is that we started, just lots of new data, data silos and along with them, management silos just kind of cropped up. And so these data store, you had your own dedicated security, privacy, and data protection policies. And it really, it was just a huge, hurdle to innovation. And I'm presuming essentially that this is a lot of what Nutanix saw when it started to, when it started to grow its business, even before you folks really got into data management.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. Like that's what we see. That when you're starting to move data in a way, or not move data, just provide an experience that's cloud-like that people can jump into, they tend to use it more, right? And so they start consuming more resources. They start finding new ways to use those applications that are running faster. And so the fact that you gave them an easier, faster, simpler way to do it doesn't mean the data goes away. It means that it actually, you're expanding on an existing problem.
And you ended up with one of everything. Now, most enterprises have always had one of everything, but now one of everything means even more things. And most enterprises have a mix of databases. It's not, even when there is an enterprise standard, typically when you get to business unit level, there's always somebody that's doing something different. And the other thing also is that the reality is that many organizations have grown through merger and acquisition. And those databases don't get migrated overnight. You hear these stories, but it's pretty unusual to see forklift migrations. And at the same time, we're developing all these new applications. And so the result is that you have this proliferation of databases. And again, as we said in the last slide, each of them have their own sort of, method of management. And so And it just adds so much over. I just oversimplified one example before of that. Each time you want something new, okay, plan to generate up a new service ticket. Then you have the DBAs come in and do the validation checks. Then the infrastructure team looks at how to deploy this, and then the dev test is to make sure that this thing is going to stand up. And this even if you basically have like a CI/CD or DevOps type of mentality, still there's just a lot of overhead each time you keep just repeating this process. And with each of these with each of these, basically dedicated management silos. I mean, you guys have just got to be seeing this all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on something. Like, I come from a background 13 years in IT, so as you're talking through these, I get the chills again, right? Like, it's like post-traumatic stress. You whether it's from an acquisition or just as you grow and change, or something just is on its own island because you can't touch it for one reason or another. You have these separate teams that are managing all these different environments. So you might have one SQL Server team, one Oracle, and then you might have a team dedicated to data warehousing, right? So you have all these different steps, and it's not wash, rinse, repeat across any of them. So when you do have that ticket come in, and they're expecting it, like, hey, I need it now. There's like literally like 15 to 20 steps you have to go through in different teams. You have the compliance team, the DBA team, the storage team. You have it could be a separate virtualization and systems team depending on the size of the organization. And then if it's set up differently each time and there's no standards, or if they lack the automation, or some things are automated, some aren't. Everything's its own snowflake. So when it comes time to troubleshoot later or figure out what's wrong, your production, dev, and test are mismatched, right? So you're just expanding on problems. It just gets exponential, and there needs to be like at that point in time when I was in, we knew we needed automation. We didn't know how we were going to bring it in, because just saying you need automation doesn't fix the problem, right? Like we wanted something from the point of like, we want some of what the cloud is providing for public cloud. We'd love that for us too, except for our databases. And that was like a wish.
And then, and you sort of subconsciously touched upon before, it's a new, you'll see a new snowflake. And just think about it. Actually, if you think about it, I mean, and Snowflake to me is kind of like, and it's huge praise to them. They're kind of the latest example of the data mart that, the data marts that just keep they keep sprouting up because the enterprise data warehouse or now the data lake just can't keep pace. And again, you end up with then yet another management silo. And so we're looking for a solution here. And the thing is that I'm a huge fan, almost you can say like a bigot, I want to call managed services. And because basically we were talking before about the appeal of the cloud being operational simplicity. Well, there are different levels of cloud service. You can go up an EC2 and run your own database. And essentially, when you do that, it's like running your own instance of Oracle or SQL Server, like it was in your own data center. The only difference is you're not having to physically deploy the hardware, but you are managing it and you are patching it and all that wonderful stuff. Well, there are managed services where the vendor basically gives you a prescribed, configuration. So, that, and maybe you have some choices, you may have, let's say, some high memory instances or high compute instances or something like that, or dense, I mean, there are different options, of course, but the thing is, these are basically configured instances. And then essentially, a proper database as a service is where you essentially, get that service. I hate to use the term buy because you're not buying it in a capital expense. You're basically buying, you're buying access to a service. You're subscribing to a service. That's probably a better way of putting it. Where the database provider, essentially does all the management, and essentially you're in charge of things like the schema and all the logical stuff. So database as a service, it automates provisioning, patching, updating, replication, all those basically non-value added housekeeping tasks. Again, remember what I said before, why enterprises going to cloud? Well, they need to spend time on the important stuff, such as we're setting up a new service Do we need to basically tap new sources of data? Do we need, how do we need to model it? How do we need to provide access to it? Those are strategic problems. But provisioning, patching, that is not strategic. That's just spinning your wheels. It also can provide more consistent security. And in so doing, the management of this is more consistent and there's less administrative overhead. So, Chris, haven't we solved the problem right there?
I'm glad you asked. It's so fortuitous you brought that up.
This is your problem from here on.
Well, I want to kind of touch on something that you brought up. When you were showing that evolution of the cloud, like one of the last things on there was like hybrid, right? So whenever you think of database as a service, I just think, public cloud, right? I think of like what they are. And if you're in those environments where there's multiple public cloud, you can have different database as a service, options even within each one, or what happens with the stuff that's on premises, right? And so the goal of what we did with our database as a service option, which is called Nutanix Era, was to kind of provide database as a service functionality on your terms. If you know anything about Nutanix, it's the fact that, what we wanted to do was bring like that cloud scale functionality that was, built from the ground up. It's in our DNA, and bring that to the data stack and what that means. I mean, we continue year after year as we grow and we build our customer base, very loyal customer base. So what we're showing is that you can scale out easy. It doesn't have to be enterprise. It doesn't have to be complex. I think when people hear that enterprise kind of name or that kind of connotation, they think, very complex and hard to use and professional services. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's what public cloud, one of the things that when people, first started dipping the toe in the water, they realized, oh, this is what it could be. That was that big shift in thinking and moving stuff to the cloud, right? That simplicity of use. And you just have services available to you on demand. And so we wanted to bring that to, the hybrid cloud environment. And we did that. And so I'm curious to see if you see the same things. We kind of see like in the before, and people, and the term we use a lot is, like the legacy, architecture, the legacy landscape, just what's been out there for the last 15, 20 years. Especially in terms of the database landscape, there's like, multiple areas where they just for day one or day two operations for database that they just consistently across the board, everybody tends to have the same problems on, right? It's, you touched on some earlier, but it's, the fact that you have the data explosion. So you have multiple copies of databases all over the place. And so it's hard to manage that many for database teams that are getting smaller, no fault of their own. It's just that for something that's in so demand, the teams are asked to do more and more, but that work is scaling out, right? They need to find a way to kind of reverse that, to do more with what they have. So they're just not putting out fires all day so they can do project work. And what we're seeing is that, that's not happening when they're on like that legacy architecture, right? And then on top of that, if they're trying to manage that on their, private infrastructure, then they have to go and be experts on what's up in the public cloud, right? Like what are all the different components for that? Like if you're in AWS or if you're in Azure, like what are all those different components that you're working with? And so they're asked to be, masters of many, right? They're, jack of all trades, and there's just not enough hours in the day. And so, especially with the complexity, if you're coming in and trying to figure out why an environment's down while you're trying to scale out a project, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Well,
and I'm assuming you do the same thing.
I was about to say, you just ruined my day. You brought me back down to reality. And I'm looking at this and like, I've seen this whiteboard so many times. I mean, I think we all have it.
This is a typical whiteboard. I mean, this is nothing that's like groundbreaking, but it's what I like. The reason I wanted to show this was, like how do you get from we talk about from point A to point Z, but what are those steps in between, right? Like those are huge jumps for corporations to do in environments. The first one that we talk about, like what's unique about database as a service for us, when I look at it, when I talk about it for myself, is that we created Era to be custom made for hyperconverged infrastructure, right? It's custom made to take advantage of our of HCI. And so like when you break this down into kind of a couple steps, probably definitely oversimplified, but in terms of from just talking about it, it's, the transform layer is like getting off that legacy infrastructure and getting onto HCI and what that gives you. And so when you look at that, you see a performance boost, your costs go down. And when I mean costs, I'm not always meaning from like a CapEx. It's definitely a CapEx, but I'm talking about just the amount of time that's saved from like troubleshooting. And then what I was talking about from just putting out fires, right? And then, that unlimited scale. We have customers that when we talk about moving over their solution over to us, they started early on when we got started. And then they just add a node. It's like a Lego block. As their environment has exploded, or as their business has done well over the years, they've grown with us. And so, new technology comes in, we incorporate that into the architecture, and they just move right over onto that new block without any forklift upgrades. I mean, the legacy environment has always like lived off of like forklift upgrades. There was a ceiling that you got to, and once you got to that ceiling, then like the only option you had was to go to the next biggest and better thing. And like it's catch-22. Like you don't have time to do that. It's cost prohibitive and it's time prohibitive, but you don't have a choice. And so what ends up happening is you create a whole new silo. And so you have a whole new separate environment and the same amount of people. So now you just increased complexity instead of reducing it.
Yeah. I mean, no question about that.
Yeah. So, and the next thing is like, once you get onto that HCI infrastructure, like now you're talking about the management portion of it. So because you don't have those silos anymore, you can mix and match workloads, and HCI is just, Nutanix, I should say, in the way our distributed architecture is kind of built out. We're prime, like in terms of performance and consolidating different workloads on there. We do best with the type of database workloads, like kind of those random IO workloads. Like we excel at it. And so you don't always have to have these dedicated silos where it's just the database goes on it, or just, this application stack goes on it where you're trying to over provision for it. And then we give you the option too, like with us, when you're managing those, like, you're trying to create copies. I know when I was in systems engineering, we always had these daily, like nightly tasks that when it was like, trying to copy over data sets from production to, sometimes it was dev, sometimes it was just for a reporting server that would take 6 to 8 hours every day. And that's if it didn't fail. And it was common times it did fail. And it was also while your backups are going on and everything else. And so it's just this kind of like tiering effect that if something fails, now you're just behind on everything. And so on top of that, with data sets that are important for tier 1 workloads, when you're creating copies of those, you're usually sitting on very expensive tier 1 storage, right? So, how do we address that? And so what we give you the ability to do is we simply took like, what if you could take, you're cloning your databases, and even if they're terabytes in size and managing them, whether they're in public cloud or on premises, what if you could just clone them and treat it like a copy and paste operation on your desktop? And then on top of that, because, you have these large data sets, how do you make it easy and as short a time as possible? Well, what Nutanix has, because we were built for HCI, we plug right into the APIs and the infrastructure that I'll point in to you later in a diagram that we have, is that what we do is like there's 0 byte clones. So we take a clone, and if it's terabytes in size, you're not duplicating that. You're just taking a point in time, image of that, and it's just a pointers. So you're talking about minutes to clone terabyte sized databases, right? So now that just opens up a whole new world of opportunities. You're able to manage what you have out there. You're not taking a storage hit if it's not changing too much. And then on top of that, now instead of having to do like 8 hour, 9 hour kind of differences, or maybe something you did once a week, you can do it once every hour. So your data is fresh, and your business and your application teams can take advantage of that. And then finally, like in terms of consolidating and securing it, once you're able to do that and see where everything's at, and you're creating these clones that are set to like best practices, you're securing it, because once you have like your golden image kind of set up that has compliance check off, you have your security, you have your patches, and you're able to see everything from a single pane of glass. And because you're trying to clone this, you're not creating that individual unique snowflake each time you build a database, or each time you create a copy that has a different configuration, right? Like you actually have like same thing that's sitting in prod is sitting in your dev and test, right? The same version. So you go to kick something off, you're like, hey, it works great. And then you roll it production. Oh, and you have an unexpected, outage, or there's an unexpected, performance degradation because it's on different versions, or there's a different type, there's different drivers or whatever that may be. So that's huge. And then finally, like the big thing is, automate. And automate's like one of those dirty words, because we talk about like automate. What does that mean? I mean, they're like, to automate is complex. So how do you make that simple? And the answer is, like, when you're setting up, trying to do database lifecycle management, when you're able to set up like your gold image, so to speak, right, and be able to set that as your foundation for everything, and set like, I want my databases to be at this level, whether it's SQL, Oracle, Postgres, MariaDB, whatever, and set those up, and then you're able to roll that same consistently and have those standards in place. All of a sudden, the troubleshooting just kind of falls to the wayside, because now you don't have all these different variables. You're able to identify that, what's the difference in what's the different software configurations out there. You have the ability to extend out like best practices out the gate with us. So now you're running best practices for that database engine, but you're running best practices for Nutanix HCI, so you're getting the best performance every time. So there's because you're not having those configuration changes. And we do that very easily, as easy as possible. And from a central control plane, whether that's in, like your private cloud or public cloud.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think I just want to go back to a point you're making earlier, which is that you talked about how often when we respond to change, it's like, oops, okay, forklift upgrade, put in a new database. And the fact is that the reality is that, we may be putting in all these new databases. We still have all these existing databases, these legacy, we call legacy databases. And they all have their separate control planes. And the thing is that what the new generation of cloud services don't do is they don't really address all that legacy that you have, on premises, or they would do it selectively within their own basically technology stack. In other words, Oracle will help you manage Oracle databases. Microsoft will help you manage those SQL Server databases. And then it goes across all that, so you still have all these separate sort of, I guess, kind of like islands of practice. So that's been basically a huge, to me, and believe me, I'm a full believer in cloud database as a service. There's no either or choice here, but the fact is that an organization is going to basically dump everything they have overnight and all of a sudden do a forklift upgrade. That just doesn't happen. They have other things that they need to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive, it's time consuming. There's interruptions in service, right? And there's unexpected consequences because they're massive. They're massive undertakings, right? So it's not ideal for anybody. So if you can like avoid that at all costs while still incorporating new technologies because they were software defined, it's a win-win for everyone, right? It's simpler, it's easier to do.
It will just be up a little bit. So years ago there was and it wasn't in the database space, but it's the same idea. It was a big basically ERP forklift upgrade. It was a Harvard Business Review case study, and they did this forklift upgrade during their peak season, Halloween, and they lost the season. So no, I mean, I think what we're realizing is that today it's like even though the economy be in revolution, or basically as we go as we start to transition to this cloud approach to to operation, it's evolution.
Exactly, that's absolutely right. And I mean, when you look at when we started about almost 11 years ago now, and customers that have grown with us, they've evolved over time how they're working, how they deploy their environments or their business think, right? Because now IT has turned into a resource forum that now they can help out line of business items. Like, how can we make more money? Because now they're more efficient. They're doing project-based work. Whereas before, it might have been known as like stuff's broken IT, right? It was like a break fix operation. And so, or it was just like, well, how can we get this done professionally? Because it takes, a month just to get something, what they term simple, but it's not simple, off the ground, right? And so public cloud was when that came about. That's why you had so many of these, like these ghost environments pop up, or not go, but rogue environments, because all somebody needed was a credit card and they could set up an instance. And all of a sudden now you're doing a project, and it's happened to me where you migrated something around and then you found out like something in the ETL process was sitting under somebody's desk, or it was running on their private account in AWS, right? Like this key component that was just outside the infrastructure was just running, right? So, because it's so easy to set up.
And by the way, did you realize that was PII data you were dealing with?
Yeah, exactly. Like, and I've worked for those companies, and that's just
Realize that.
terrifying. Yeah, like you're just like, oh my goodness, how do we control this? And so you're getting into like the day to day, just like Herculean tasks that IT has to undertake and all the different changes. So if you can provide something, no matter how minuscule it is, like to make that simple, that's something that like that is gold to IT. And so that's why, like we pride ourselves at, at Nutanix for, trying to make it simple. Like, the ethos of what we do that's built into our DNA is like, okay, think from the ground up in terms of what it means to make this simple. And so somebody can use this, like, you don't pull out a 300-page manual to use your iPhone, right? So like you should, and it should be intuitive in design. So that's what we try to do. And we get feedback from customers, and over time we've evolved to do that. And, in terms of this like kind of diagram, what we're doing here, and all I wanted to show quickly on this is just, you have your infrastructure services that are a big part of that with HCI in terms of cluster to cluster, or, data center to data center and public cloud. Like you can scale that out. And we have a new offering from Nutanix now that it's clusters, Nutanix clusters on AWS, where you can run on bare metal AWS Nutanix clusters. And that gives you a lot of different options and opportunities from a central management plane, which is huge, to still run it on, not changing what you have to do from jumping into a different, management, tool set, or, you can still take those standards and everything else that you're building in and kind of extend it out to the cloud. That's very available. And so what we did, this is just kind of what I was talking about earlier. We just took that, and whether you're accessing from, API, GUI, or CLI for those database engines listed, that just plugs right in on top of that HCI and runs. In fact, Era, you can't run on anything else except Nutanix HCI. And that's what gives its ability to, get those storage savings, the speed, simplicity, and just the scale out that you get with that. But,
Actually,
what does that mean?
I was going to say what you guys have done. It's kind of like eating your own dog food here. Is that when you came up with, with essentially extending this out to your database solution, you didn't invent a whole new stack. You leveraged the virtual infrastructure, the hyperconverged infrastructure that you already had, and you basically then extended that to support, essentially the automation of the management of databases. You didn't invent a whole new silo.
Exactly. And because we are so like we didn't want to create nine to get out there, like, what we didn't want to do is, we know we're not dumb. We know that companies have their own processes in place. They might have their own automation stack, right? They're, whatever is deploying out. If you have those DevOps teams that have a preferred method for deploying their LAMP stack environments, and they built that out and they've ironed those things out, we'll keep using that. But because we're so API focused and centric, that like, use us when you're deploying that out, you still want that database to match what's in production, everything else. Just make an API call out. We plug right into it. Like, there's videos that we have from when, if you're creating a ServiceNow ticket, or if you're trying to, do Chef or, Ansible or anything else, it plugs right in. And now when that SQL server or that Oracle database needs to be deployed, like, you can actually plug right in. It makes that call out to Era, and it'll deploy that. In fact, one of our big use cases is, out of the four that we do, and the four service pillars we work on, is what we call one-click provisioning, right? So that's exactly that. It's one click's a little bit oversimplification, but it's essentially, once you get that set up in that image, what could take hours, and we're not talking about just individual simple databases. We're talking like Oracle rack setups that are very complex, or a SQL Server availability group. You can have deployed a full SQL Server availability group in an hour, in some cases, sometimes even less, depending on how that deployment is set. And with best practices and standards, so you're not going to have any deviations from like your setup baseline. You can also do that. The cool thing about that is, like, when we have those videos where we show, like, from ServiceNow, or we can do like self-service. So if you're a DBA team that's just like a customer of ours, a good example, we had a customer where they had 30 to 40% of their DBA teams were coming up to retire. They had a very experienced team, and they just knew, just the way the marketplace was and demand for talent, that even if they could backfill all those, they were losing about anywhere from like 20 to 25 years experience for each person, that they just weren't going to be able to realistically fill that back in. And so they did that through automation. Like, how do we make it for the guys that we're able to hire that maybe not have the experience, or with the existing guys, not to work them to death? Well, they enabled a couple things. One was self-service. So they were able to create rule sets to say like, the DevOps team can deploy this type of database to this cluster and these t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large. And then, the fact that it didn't take all day long to deploy a database, they were able to still deploy those out. And because they had those guidelines on there, when a service ticket came in, they were automating that all the way through. The service ticket came in, once it got approved, database deployment happened, right? And that full lifecycle management, how long does it stay out there so it's just not eating up a license? Does it, spin back down? So, like in terms of like day two operations, like how do you patching? Like that's top of everybody's mind is security. But then when it comes down to doing it, that's where when you have all those multiple databases, that's when like you start hearing those horror stories where people were in certain, they were like enterprises were trying to manage the patch load and they were trying to roll it out. And by the time the next patching cycle comes through, they haven't even gotten all the way through the first one that just came through. And you hear about companies getting owned and like, important data getting breached. I mean, it makes headline news every time. So it's expensive from a client perspective.
It's basically a very sort of quote unquote stupid little backdoor. And the fact is that regardless of whether you're operating on premises or in the cloud, it's that so to make sure that the authentication, and the passwords basically are not leaked out. And the fact is that when you're doing all this maintenance on all these different management silos, something's going to happen, and something will get left open by mistake. I mean, the more and more management complexity you have, the more and more chance you have for things like this to happen.
Or the hold your breath moment, like it's been patched. Like let's make sure it comes back up, and you're trying to get all the teams online to make sure and validate, like at 2 a.m. or whenever that that management window is that you have. So again, you're giving me chills as we talk. You're kind of walking through that, like again on those copy data management. I know this is an eye chart. I just wanted to kind of show and give breath to what we do from a service pillar. We talked about provisioning. We jumped to database protection and what that is, and copy data management we've touched on in terms of like cloning and snapshotting, and that ties into what we mean from overall database protection as well. So what we have now is the ability to take a snapshot, and it's really more focused for the DBA. I know teams are still going to have their whole backup methods and what they do for HA is probably from more of a database incident level. But if you have a table that it gets deleted, and because you can easily snapshot or clone a database at ease, near instantaneously without interrupting production, and you have a lot of copies, you can almost roll back to the moment that you lost that table, or like if somebody fat fingered something that they weren't supposed to, or maybe you didn't lock down permissions like you thought, that junior DBA like wiped something out, you can do an in-place restore and recover that very easy, right? So it's giving you the option. And like we still recommend, like still have that's not a replacement for having those HA methods in place for like if a node in a cluster goes down, like we tie in very well with that from the database level, but from in a compliance level, definitely back it up. But from that point in time, like from an operational, like every DBA that I ever known had his own little backups off to the side, right? Or he had those like SQL backup jobs kicking off, and every so often on something very important that he had access to, so he could restore it. So you have those options, and so the idea is like the difference, like if you were to take it, like look at it with the lens of like what we do specifically, with database as a service, is for that DBA, for that accidental database admin, for that systems engineer trying to manage all that. Let's just stretch you thin. Let's make it easy, simple. Get them working on projects for the company, things that matter from perspective of trying to move the company forward versus just coming in and trying to, battle through tickets that are taking all day, or just this unnecessary minutia of workload of daily operational life that, for one reason or another, from the database or data perspective, has always been very manual and error prone. Like, let's get that out of the way and make it simpler for everyone. So, in a nutshell, that's what we're doing.
Especially there's one term you left out, which is consistent. Make it consistent.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that consistently comes in is on why that ties into availability. Like a lot of times, if I were like when I started this role here, I would have thought people said when it comes to their data, like speed and making sure it's fast. No, like the top thing that, and it may be different from when you're talking to customers, but at least the customers I talk to, that availability, like it doesn't matter if it's fast if that database isn't up, right? Like it doesn't matter that I can deploy it quickly if like it's going down every so often, or right when like, you know, if it's your busy season, like you're crossing your fingers, it can withstand the load. It needs to be available, and sometimes being slow is not being available, right? So that's how, you know, with the mix of HCI and database as a service, the value that we're bringing in is that simple. We're removing that complexity from that legacy architecture. It's obviously fast. I mean, we have, you know, data points and use cases, but it's fast to deploy as well. So, and we have examples and data sets where companies were able to deploy whole dev test environments like 10x faster, right? Again, being able to deploy a single instance in minutes. That's when I say any single instance, I mean a whole database server in minutes, and, you know, full rack installs in, you know, an hour. And because that cost effectiveness, those aren't like, you know, kind of magic numbers. That comes from a couple areas. Like if you're not needing to buy as much of this siloed infrastructure that's very expensive, then that saves you money. And if you're not having, you know, where you were running 30 databases before because you don't have those silos now and they're not over provisioned, you can potentially save on database licensing as well. But then there's like kind of the unheralded cost of like, you know, how much is your team's time's worth, right? If you're not able to get that new project out the door, that's an initiative for like your company's new, you know, step forward to profitability, and you can't get that project moving forward because your resources are always locked up, then, you know, what's that worth to you? And so, you know, what's it worth to get from a DBA's perspective their weekend back, right? So they're not always, you know, troubleshooting till 3 a.m. or, you know, focused on trying to get projects out, you know, Saturday through Sunday, and then trying to hit the ground run again on Monday, hoping everything works. You know, those are the things that, you know, director, CIO, VP of IT need to think about when they're rolling this out, and like where database as a service, you know, means everything to them. Those are the costs they have to take into account when they're doing that.
Yep. It's 3 a.m. Do you know where your database as a service is? Oh, yes, it's being
Exactly. That should be my new T-shirt I have.
Exactly. Yeah. Sounds like your next marketing campaign.
I think so. I'll send you one.
It's 3 a.m.
So, you know, I've talked a lot. Like, go ahead.
It's 3 a.m. Do you know where your resources are?
Ooh, hopefully they're not at work. You know, that point, like, you know, one of the things, like you gave this a great kind of like intro and where the market is and like the evolution and what it means, like where database as a service, like, you know, from being a cloud to database as a service. And then I just kind of came in and tried to, at a high level, talk about what it means from a Nutanix perspective. But for those that want to read more on, you know, hear Tony's expertise on the environment, we do have the paper that he has written available. And David Davis at the beginning kind of pointed that out, like in terms of resources. You'll see it out there. Please do check that out. Our big .next conference, which is digital for the first time this year because the situation as it is September 8th. And so we have some great keynote speakers. You're going to get some deep dives into Oracle, SQL Server on Nutanix, as well as what we're doing new with Era. And it's free, completely free. So hear the experts talk, and go check out nutanix.com/next to see who are the guest keynote speakers. And, you know, like I said, it's free. Register, sign up, and go check out those database focused and Nutanix Era focused speaking engagements that we have during that time, and get signed up. And Tony, before we let go, like one of the things, or we kind of move forward, I do want to give you an opportunity. One thing that I meant to ask you earlier is give your like your breadth of experience. I guess that's something like you have this amazing amount of wealth. Where does it come from? Like where is like the background on, and what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, my background, basically, I think we both have hair tracks on our forehead. I've been in this business for about 30 years. And I've been basically as an analyst, and I've been following all levels of the stack. Initially, I was basically, in a way, I could say I was for database before I was against it, before I was for them. It's not an exaggeration, but paraphrasing of an old politician's statement. But I started focusing on data platforms back during that whole sort of client server evolution back about 30 years ago, where we were looking at quote unquote downsizing from the mainframe, which really was not downsizing. But we were going to these new distributed databases, and distributed at that point meant you weren't on the mainframe. It didn't mean that the database itself was distributed, but we had more of these databases around the companies as opposed to let that one basically IMS green screen. And the idea is we had it came basically, and it was sort of a perfect storm. It came in conjunction with with client server, with .com and Y2K, and so that's really where I started to follow all this. And then, of course, with the internet coming in, started to overwhelm, the ability of databases to handle all this. And so this old idea of the transaction monitor became now the web application server. So for about 10 years, I focused on middleware, on the middle tier, because databases could not keep up. But it got to the point where the pendulum swung the other way, where the data got so massive that it just, it overpowered the middleware. And by that point, we started, to have open source technologies which allowed scale out. And that's right, so back about a dozen years ago, I dove right back into this as quote unquote big data was emerging. And with all this, I was actually, for a long time, I really could care less about the cloud. I thought, so what, you're just running a few cycles, on EC2. But then when I saw that essentially that when you go cloud native, that it really changes how you architect databases and how you use databases and how you use database services and how this can change life for the enterprise. That's where I really kind of got very interested in looking at this whole sort of cloud transformation. This was happening before the pandemic. I see coming out of the pandemic, it's just accelerating it. It's accelerating all the secular trends that we've been talking about. So I've been just following just all just in terms of how we've been dealing with data, for just too long, much too long.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
Yeah, I really enjoyed our discussion.
So before we go to any questions that you guys might have, one thing I did want to point out is if you want to do kind of a hands-on kind of demo of Nutanix Era, go to nutanix.com/test-era, and you can actually go out there and deploy a database. It's a real live environment. It's not scripted, and you can do a walkthrough, and it helps guide you what to click on. So it's actually a living online environment that you can try without actually having Nutanix in your data center. So feel free to go check that out and see what you think. David, do we have any questions?
We don't have a lot of time left for questions, but we've got a few questions here coming in from the audience. If you have a question about the Nutanix Era service or anything that Tony talks about in his paper, I encourage you to get your questions in now. If we don't get to them right now, we'll do our best to get back to those electronically. I do want to thank you, Chris and Tony. Really excellent presentation, excellent discussion. I love the back and forth. I learned a lot. I know that the audience did as well. Before we go, probably just time for just one quick question, I would say, with each of you. And I'll ask Tony first. Tony, with the emergence of cloud native databases, what are enterprises really embracing out there for their DB strategy in the future?
We'll put it this way. What I do see, and I sort of hinted about this before, is that it's not kind of black or white, or it's not a binary decision. Cloud native databases actually have a lot of appeal. And the thing is, there are a lot of organizations that are now really looking at, basically working with a lot of these cloud services. And that's fine. If anything, they're giving enterprise a taste of what the operational simplicity of the cloud can do. I think the reason why we're having this discussion today is that, of course, enterprises have many other databases that they've been working with on premises all these years. So they may migrate some of them. Some of them may move to, let's say, like Amazon Aurora or something like that, or RDS. But there are many others that basically are probably probably not going to move, where basically if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But on the other hand, they want to, essentially the reason for our discussion today is how can we rationalize this whole portfolio of databases that we already have. So I really see it's kind of like, instead of a future of 1,000 flowers blooming, so to speak, it's not going to be an either or choice. So that's what I'm seeing.
Okay, good insight. And Chris, I wanted to ask you, if people go to the Nutanix Era test drive link here, which is also in the handouts tab, and sign up for the test drive, can you kind of walk us through what happens next? What do they receive?
Yeah, so you'll get an email with a log on and a link for you to follow. And then once you log on through that link, you'll actually have a walkthrough menu. So if you want to refresh a database instance, you can click on that, and then you'll have like little kind of notes that pop up. It's a little bit like choose your own adventure, but it's guided. So when you're clicking on it, like to clone and refresh database, or if you want to provision like a Postgres database, you click on that section, and then it'll walk you through like little notes off to the side of what to click next and dig into it. And you can actually see it in real time. Take and deploy that database. And then you can kind of walk through. It's an actual living Era instance, so you can kind of see the different database profiles. You can kind of click through and check out what it looks like from a patching perspective and the different databases that are out there. So, and you can actually see what's been cloned and the different instances that are in the environment and what flavors are out there. So it's an actual living, breathing instance, so they can actually kick the tires. But you can actually deploy, provision, and refresh a database at this time. And we're about to do an update where you're going to have some additional capabilities like patching and I believe in-place restore as well coming up very soon.
Awesome. I love that. Kind of choose your own adventure, play with this virtual lab environment. Sounds really fun and educational and a great way to learn about database as a service. I'm afraid that's all the time we have really on today's webinar. But again, Chris and Tony, excellent presentation. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for having me.
I want to thank everyone out there in our audience. We really appreciate your participation on today's webinar. Before you go, don't forget about the handouts tab. It's there that you can download Tony's paper on how to turn your database into a service. Make sure that you download that before you go. Also, click on that link, the Test Drive Era link, where you can try out the Nutanix Database as a Service solution for yourself for free as well. It's quick and easy. Again, thank you to Nutanix for supporting us. And thanks, Tony and Chris. We'll see you next time.